This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the circle was red, the study was scarlet, and the Scot was glorious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the giant rat of Sumatra, the remarkable worm unknown to science, or the repulsive story of the red leech?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 236, Holmes and Lestrade Through the Years. Well, hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look at the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, is that how you pronounce it? Because I know we're going to have a whole Lestrade, underlying debate here. And I want to make sure I'm pronouncing Burt Wolder correctly.
Well, yeah, a lot of my, this has gone on a lot during my life, but certainly in the last 10 or 15 years, most people do tend to pronounce my name. They tend to pronounce it George Clooney. And, I don't want to insult anybody's judgment. So normally, I'll go along with it to some degree, sign a couple of autographs and move on.
Well, that's because you're a gentleman, George. So,
yeah, Gentleman George, that's me.
Well, if you would like to check out the show notes for this episode, which may or may not include reference to George Clooney, go to ihose.co/trifles236, all lowercase. That will take you to the SherlockHolmesPodcast.com page, exactly where the notes for this episode live. You can find all kinds of things there, including the ability to comment on this episode, which you can also do by sending us an email at trifles@ihearofsherlock.com. We are on all of the major social networks as I Hear of Sherlock, and of course you can support us via PayPal or Patreon, Patreon preferred, by clicking on that Become a Patron button on the show. Helps us keep the lights on and keep the ideas flowing, which, from time to time tend to get stuck and muddled. Well, here we are talking about Holmes and Lestrade. Now, I prefer the Jeremy Brett pronunciation, Lestrade. Bert, I know you favor the Basil Rathbone pronunciation, Lestrade. Tomato. We're not going to call the whole thing off. We are here to spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about the relationship between Holmes and Watson throughout their respective careers. Now, this topic, interestingly, was suggested to us very generously by one of our listeners, Ron Lees. Ron put together a paper called Tracking the Friendship of Holmes and Lestrade, a canonical review, and it was dedicated to his friend Esmeralda, who started this conversation. I think we know Esmeralda is probably Sandy Cozen from the Hounds of the Internet. And Ron writes, I often wondered about the changing relationship between Sherlock Holmes, the world's only consulting detective, and Lestrade of Scotland Yard. Were they friends? Were they rivals? Were they enemies? Colleagues? So I started tracking that relationship through the canon and seeing how Holmes and Lestrade worked together and how their relationship developed over the years. Now, Ron says Holmes and Lestrade worked together actively in 11 cases, and in 2 other cases, The Sign of the Four and the disappearance of Lady Frances Carfax, Lestrade is mentioned, but he doesn't appear. And Ron went through these in chronological order as per Martin Dakin. in his a study in Holmes. Is that what the Dakin book is called? A Sherlock Holmes commentary. Maybe that's what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So we thought we would look at these, not in total, because we don't want to have you sit through all 11 cases and us trying to work our way through each one of those. But we figured we'd pick out some from the beginning, the middle, and the end to illustrate some of these relationship milestones and talk about them. So, Bert, it seems like it would make the most sense to begin at the beginning.
It's a great place to begin. And boy, talk about beginning at the beginning, because when we first meet John H. Watson, and he's associated himself with Sherlock Holmes, Watson is very puzzled by the actions, the activities, the lifestyle of his new rooming partner. And he reports in the case of A Study in Scarlet, he says, during the first week or so, we had no callers. And I had begun to think that my companion was as friendless a man as I was myself. Presently, however, I found that he had many acquaintances in very different classes of society. There was one little sallow, rat-faced, dark-eyed fellow who was introduced to me as Mr. Lestrade, Lestrade, who came 3 or 4 times in a single week. And that's really the very first reference we have to Lestrade. But we soon get to see, much more of him. And in fact, when we're on the murder scene, Watson notices by now this familiar face of Lestrade. He says, Lestrade, lean and ferret-like as ever, was standing by the doorway and greeted my companion and myself. Well, of course, it's in Study in Scarlet that we have Holmes' first introduction of anyone in Scotland Yard to Watson. And he says he and Lestrade, he's speaking now of Gregson, are the pick of a bad lot. They're quick and energetic, but they're conventional, shockingly conventional. And they have their knives into one another. And they're as jealous as a pair of professional beauties. Oh, there'll be some fun over this case if they're both put on the scent.
And you know what's interesting to me as Watson becomes familiar with Lestrade, as Holmes describes who he is. I love that pick of a bad lot phrase there. It's something that's stuck with me since my very first reading of A Study in Scarlet. And that is that Holmes describes Lestrade as he's describing himself. He says, I suppose I'm the only one in the world, a consulting detective. And you can understand what that is. We have lots of government detectives, lots of private ones. And he gets to Lestrade. He says, it is odd if you can't unravel if you have all the details of 1,000 at your finger ends. It's odd if you can't unravel the 1,001st. Lestrade is a well-known detective. He got himself into a fog recently over a forgery case, and that was what brought him here. So that's interesting that Holmes would defer to Lestrade as being a well-known detective in the very first story about Holmes and Watson, where he himself is trying to become a well-known detective.
Well, that is interesting. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. I hadn't thought of that identification, a well-known detective, because, generally what we have look, the very first reference we have about Scotland Yard is bad lot. So that this so-called well-known detective, this community of which he is well-known, is, on a whole, pretty unimpressive, let's say, to Sherlock Holmes. So that they're the pick of a bad lot, but that's true, and, I think the interesting thing about this topic and why it's such a great idea that Ron had is that you can see over time how Holmes and Lestrade, how the relationship is described, in different ways, and draw some conclusions about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's just a marvelous and certainly stark contrast between the two, between the professional detective, the Scotland Yarder, excuse me, and the consulting detective in Sherlock Holmes. And, by the time we get to the end of the story, Holmes does his thing, right? He manages to solve the crime, and it's very clear that he is going to let Lestrade and Gregson take all the credit for the case. And this puzzles Watson. I'm certain it puzzles him in part because he's just, first of all, spent the last week or two, however long the case lasted, partially in the company of these duffers. And he can see, I think, that early reference of Holmes saying that Lestrade is a well-known detective. I think Watson can see a glimpse in Holmes's eye, or at least in Holmes's mind, that he too would like to become a well-known detective. And of course, that's the role that Watson fills in that regard. So it's got to be puzzling to Watson when we get to the end and the credit goes to the Scotland Yarders. And he says, the division seems rather unfair, I remarked. You have done all the work in this business. I get a wife. Oh, no, wait, that's the sign of 4. That's the wrong ending. But it's a similar ending, isn't it? Hang on. Hold, please.
Well, it's a, while you're looking that up, one of the things that you could refer to as early in Scotland Yard, Holmes seems resigned to the fact that Gregson and Lestrade will pocket all the credit. He says, Holmes has been sort of lolling around. And now he's had this note from Gregson about this mysterious event in Lauriston Gardens. And Watson says, well, surely there's not a moment to be lost. And Holmes says, well, what does it really matter to me? Very uncharacteristically, we'll never see him adopt this attitude again. What does it matter to me, man? Suppose I figure it all out. You'll be sure that Gregson and Lestrade will pocket all the credit because I'm very unofficial.
Yeah.
And then Watson says, but he begs you to help him he says of Gregson. And Holmes says, yeah, well, he knows I'm his superior, but he would cut his tongue out before he would own it to any third person. However, I suppose it's not going to hurt to go and have a look, he says.
Right. No, I think that's key right there. That's right there. And certainly, that comes to fruition in the end when they pick up a copy of the Echo and Watson reads it. The public, it said, have lost a sensational treat through the sudden death of the man Hope, who is suspected of the murder of Mr. Enoch Trevor, blah, blah, blah. And then it gets to, it is an open secret that the credit of this smart capture belongs entirely to the well-known Scotland Yard officials, Messrs. Lestrade and Gregson. The man was apprehended, appears, in the rooms of a certain Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who has himself, as an amateur, shown some talent in the detective line, and who, with such instructors, may hope in time to attain to some degree of their skill. and Holmes said, didn't I tell you so when we started? That's the result of all our study in Scarlet, to get them a testimonial. So Holmes seems completely resigned to it. And again, as I started off mentioning in A Study in Scarlet, it isn't Lestrade in that case. Of course, it's Athelney Jones, but the outcome is very much the same in somebody else getting the credit rather than Sherlock Holmes.
Yes.
So, well, also in one of the earlier cases, I think Ron talks about Boscom Valley mystery.
Well, yeah, before that, I think Ron talks about Cardboard Box.
Oh, yes, Cardboard Box, yeah.
Note, which we should touch on.
Please.
Because, there's, without getting into the details of what's going on here, there's a point early on in the case where Holmes sort of sums things up to Watson, and he says, there are really some very unique features about this case. Watson, I think now is the time we took our friend Lestrade into our confidence, because he's had his little smile at our expense, and perhaps we may do as much by him. So here, you again have this sense of amused rivalry. Holmes knows he's the superior to these people. And, you have that in that commentary. And then, of course, one of the things that happens in Cardboard Box is that a good deal of information is drawn from a particular roped knot. And Holmes holds this up to Lestrade and says, the importance lies in the fact that the knot is left intact, and the knot is of a peculiar character. And to his credit, Lestrade says, oh, yeah, I've already made a note of that. It's very neatly timed.
So almost, anything you can deduce, I can deduce better.
Yeah. Yeah, I knew you would write something like that down, Mr. Holmes, so I've written it down here. See, it says not equals no. Neat, right? See, neatly tied.
Not there. Yes. Well, and it's interesting because Holmes does, I think, make a very workmanlike case out of this particular investigation. And by the time we get to the end, when Jim Browner arrives, Watson writes, he will be met with, Holmes said this, when Jim Browner arrives, he will be met by the obtuse but resolute Lestrade, and I have no doubt that we shall have all of our details filled in. Now, of course, Holmes wasn't thinking that Lestrade would help with the details. He was thinking Jim Browner would be helpful with the details there. And of course, Lestrade isn't interested in sharing credit or even giving Holmes his due in terms of a fine job. He sent Holmes a note later on where he wrote, the affair proves, as I always thought it would, to be an extremely simple one, but I am obliged to you for assisting me in my investigation. With kind regards, yours very truly, G. Lestrade.
Yes. Oh, and that G has led to a lot of speculation about what Lestrade's first name really could have been. But earlier on, we have another, in that case, before the conclusion, obviously, we have another opportunity for Sherlock Holmes to offer another assessment of the character of Lestrade. And he says, he says to Watson, I've written to Lestrade to ask him to supply us with the details which we're now wanting. And I'm sure he can be trusted to do that, for although he is absolutely devoid of reason, he is as tenacious as a bulldog when he once understands what he has to do. And indeed, it is just this tenacity which has brought him to the top at Scotland Yard.
That's funny. Well, and that's an interesting character attribute. I mean, not everyone rises to that level of, incompetence. The Peter principle. But at least Lestrade had that tenacity, and that is something that can be said positively about him. Yeah, well, absolutely. Let's say something positive about our sponsor, and we'll be back right after this quick word. The Baker Street Journal continues to be the leading Sherlockian publication since its founding in 1946 by Edgar W. Smith. In its pages, you'll find both serious scholarship and articles that play the game. The journal is essential reading for anyone interested in Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and a world where it's always 1895. If you subscribe to the Baker Street Journal, you'll get 4 quarterly issues as well as the Christmas annual. You don't have to be a member of the BSI or of any Sherlockian society for that matter to subscribe to the journal. It's open to anyone who enjoys talking about, reading about, and writing about Sherlock Holmes. And you can also contribute to the BSJ. Your imagination is the only limitation there. So get on the bandwagon and subscribe to the Baker Street Journal this year. Make it an important part of your commitment to the world of Sherlock Holmes. Just go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and subscribe. today. All right, we're back talking about Lestrade and Holmes and their friendship. And let's turn to the Boscom Valley mystery. This was also another earlier case. We've got two other ones that we want to talk about before we get out of here. But the Boscom Valley mystery is interesting because this appeared early on in the adventures. And here we have Lestrade introduced in the traditional way, where Watson describes him as a lean, ferret-like man, furtive and sly-looking. He was waiting for us upon the platform. And we're already led to believe that Lestrade is, somewhat underhanded, somewhat, as all of these attributes would make him, being furtive and sly, ferret, fox, etc. However, what's interesting is Lestrade actually shows a little deference to Holmes in this case. He said, "I've ordered a carriage," said Lestrade as we sat over a cup of tea. "I knew your energetic nature and that you would not be happy until you had been on the scene of the crime." And Holmes answered, "It was very nice and complimentary of you." I thought, how marvelous. I mean, what a nice little exchange there. That didn't need to be included, but it certainly shows that the two understand how each other prefer to work.
Yeah, well, it is, and it is very nice and complimentary of Lestrade. And in fact, now we're in around 1890, so let's say for the sake of argument, 3 years, 36 months, several cases, only one or two of which Watson has told us about, have taken place in which Lestrade and Holmes worked together, or Holmes was helpful to Lestrade. And so clearly there's been a great change in the climate, even though that first sketch by which the character of Lestrade is laid down, lean and rat-faced and ferret-like, which is such a contrast to the way Gregson is drawn, because my memory of the sketch of Gregson is he's big and blonde and hardy. But in any case, once drawn, there he is. He's the ferret-like, rat-like guy. But clearly things have moved on. And later on in the case, you've got another one of these lovely little opportunities where Watson observes Holmes in his fashion, astonishing Lestrade. So Watson tells us, Lestrade and I walked behind him. The detective was indifferent and contemptuous while I watched. So the detective here is Lestrade. And Holmes suddenly asks of Lestrade, "What did you go into the pool for?" And Lestrade says, "Oh, well, I fished around with a rake. I thought there might be a weapon or some other trace, but wait a second, how on earth did you know that?" and Holmes says, "Oh, tut, tut, I have no time. That left foot of yours with its inward twist is all over the place. A mole could trace it, and there it vanishes among the reeds."
I love that. It's a little bit of a dig there, a dig at Lestrade's physical comportment as well as his professional techniques. Holmes gets a 2-for-1 in there, clearly frustrated by the ham-handedness by which Lestrade and his men have taken the case on.
Yes, and then later on in the case, of course, there's another interchange. Holmes finds the murder weapon and presents it to Lestrade, and here Lestrade really stands up to his prior description as being completely devoid of reason. So Holmes says, "Well, this may interest you, Lestrade. The murder was done with it." And Lestrade looks at it and says, "I see no marks." And Holmes says, "There are none." "Well, how do you know then?" And Holmes says, "Well, the grass was growing under it. It had only lain there a few days." And this, Lestrade finds terribly amusing. Look, theories are all very well, and he laughs, but we have to deal with a British jury. I'm a practical man, I don't want to become the laughing stock of Scotland Yard.
I'd prefer to be the laughing stock of Baker Street. Oh, well, let's advance to another case. We are post-Reichenbach. We're going to head to Norwood, the Norwood builder, as we have it from the Dakin chronology taking place in 1894. And interestingly, upon Holmes's return, there was a wonderful scene where Scotland Yard is called to capture Colonel Moran, and Holmes says, instead of being ruined, my good sir, as he clapped Lestrade on the shoulder, instead of being ruined, my good sir, you will find that your reputation has been enormously enhanced. Just make a few alterations in that report which you were writing, and they will understand how hard it is to throw dust in the eyes of Inspector Lestrade. A little bit of a professional boosterism going on there. And I think the rest of us can see it, Holmes means it about as sincerely as he means that he, enjoys Watson's early writings. But I'm sure it worked wonders with Lestrade himself.
Well, yes, I think that really is lovely. And the Norwood Builder, is another great case, because here we have an opportunity where you really get a sketch from Lestrade of his reaction to what Holmes has done. Of course, before there's an early scene in Norwood Builder where John Hector McFarlane is about to be arrested, and Holmes needs more time with him. And, Lestrade says, well, it's difficult for me to refuse you anything because you have been of use to the force, and we owe you a good turn. So that gets to happen. But, sort of at the end of the case, as when the case is solved, Lestrade actually shares a confidence to Holmes, and he says, Mr. Holmes, he says, I could not speak before the constables, but I don't mind saying in the presence of Dr. Watson that this is the brightest thing you've done yet. And yet it's a mystery to me how you did it. You saved an innocent man's life. You've prevented a very grave scandal. And this would have ruined my reputation in the force.
Yeah, because Lestrade was so cocksure about his initial, I was going to say diagnosis, but his initial conclusion seemed to be an open and shut case. And, he even sent a message to Holmes in the middle of this. Said, important fresh evidence to hand. McFarlane's guilt definitely established. Advise you to abandon case, Lestrade. And Watson says, oh, this sounds serious. And Holmes replies, it is Lestrade's little cockadoodle of victory, with a bitter smile. And yet it may be premature to abandon the case. So, again, we're seeing this back and forth between the two, with Lestrade eventually, as you say, eating crow amid his cockadoodle. Kind of a cockadoodle don't. And admitting that Holmes actually did save him from professional embarrassment, which is that's a big leap from this guy that we've seen over the last, 10 or so years, with Holmes, 12 years with Holmes.
Well, it is magnificent. And should we sort of move on here and conclude?
Oh, the ultimate conclusion. Absolutely. This is the one we always want to land on.
Yeah. Now we're in the year 1900. And so there's been a considerable amount of time, let's say 13 years, where they've been engaged. And, we find that almost in the very beginning of that particular case, because Watson tells us it was no very unusual thing at this point for Mr. Lestrade of Scotland Yard to look in upon us of an evening, and his visits were welcome to Sherlock Holmes. Well, for they enabled him to keep in touch with all that was going on in police headquarters. So now Lestrade is just without any, particular case or particular urgency or particular emergency, drops in on an evening, and his visits are very welcome, and he's sharing gossip with Holmes about what's going on at police headquarters. And in return for the news, Watson says that Lestrade would bring, Holmes was always ready to listen with attention to the details of any case in which the detective was engaged. So it sounds as if by this point, Holmes is almost, a consultant, a permanent personal consultant or therapist to Lestrade. And without any active interference, Holmes is able to give some hint or suggestion, drawn from his own knowledge and experience.
Yeah. And they seem so comfortable together that when Holmes says, anything remarkable on hand? And Lestrade says, oh, no, nothing very particular. Then Holmes leans forward and says, well, tell me about it. And Lestrade laughed at, this is exactly what they both enjoyed. So it's a wonderful evolution of a sense of comfort and of camaraderie that the two are reaching at this point. And of course, we know Lestrade was kind of going along with Holmes's fanciful ideas, or what he thought were Holmes's fanciful ideas about this, the bust business again. And eventually, in the end, where Holmes manages to find one of the last remaining Napoleons, smashes it open, and says, gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to the Black Pearl of the Borgias. Lestrade was completely astounded and says, well, I've seen you handle a good many cases, Mr. Holmes, but I don't know that I ever knew a more workman-like one than that. We're not jealous of you at Scotland Yard. No, sir, we're very proud of you. And if you come down tomorrow, there's not a man, from the oldest inspector to the youngest constable, who wouldn't be glad to shake you by the hand. And you think about what it took for Lestrade to go to that level of appreciation and, the ultimate compliment for Holmes. This is seemingly something that Holmes has been waiting his entire career for from Lestrade. And his response, if you would like to read it, I think speaks volumes about Holmes's own demeanor and attitude toward Lestrade.
Well, it's just the absolute wonderful moment. And of course, what precedes that commentary by Lestrade is Holmes' explanation of how he arrived at the conclusions he did, but also he produces, like a conjurer, the Black Pearl of the Borgias. And Watson says, Lestrade and I sat silent for a moment, and then with a spontaneous impulse, we both broke out clapping as at the well-wrought crisis of a play. And that is, just uninhibited emotion being expressed there. And it's lovely to look back over this trajectory and see the relationship deepen, the characters become more human, the emotions build, better working relationships develop. It's just a tiny part of what you have in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
It is. And Holmes' response to that, indicated not only his love of the theatrical, but also his appreciation for Lestrade when he said, thank you. And Watson says, as he turned away, it seemed to me that he was more nearly moved by the softer human emotions than I had ever seen him. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You take my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Mr. Holmes! Lestrade, how nice to see you.
So it really is you. I had your message. I could scarce believe it.
Oh, I forgot to mention that we talked about G. Lestrade, and I don't know if we ever have uncovered this before, but I had seen some scholarship that because Lestrade was so surprising in his conclusions around his colleagues at the office at Scotland Yard, they began referring to him as OMG Lestrade. Sorry, I'll go away now.